Hello, everybody. So our very first speaker for today is Alesha Mehta. She will be presenting ritual as a method toward a decolonial choreographic practice. Alesha Mehta is a current doctoral student at the University of Auckland, whose research engages with Vedic philosophies and ritual practice towards multiplicity in choreographic practice. Alesha's research explores ritual as a choreographic method toward decolonizing her personal performance practices to foreground her cultural heritage in her artistic practices. Her research interests that reside within decolonization, feminism, ritual, posthumanism, and choreographic practice. Thank you, Alesha, for being part of the CS conference. I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm feeling very, very grateful to be here. I'm based in Aotearoa, so it is the evening for me and my Friday night. So no better way to spend my Friday night. I'm just going to share my screen. And I think you'll be able to see this. Cool. So, ritual is, sorry. We'll work with this. Ritual is not simply an alternative way to express any manner of thing, but that certain meanings and effects can best or even only be expressed or achieved in ritual. This quote from anthropologist Rory Rappaport acts as a prompt, a pillar, and a companion when I think about ritual, autoethnographic creative practice, and decolonisation. My research today has come from my autoethnographic research, and at times it is difficult to separate this from my life and histories and memories. So through this journey, they have intertwined into each other. So for the next few moments, I will unravel through storytelling how ritual decolonizes my practice. Now, I have a very long history with rituals. From the time I was taught to strike a match and light our home temple's liwo or candle, to the times my mum would let me take 2 weeks off school. Yeah, 2 weeks off school to go dance with the goddess at Goba for 9 nights. Rituals have always been a part of my life and have played a crucial role in how I perceive myself in relation to the world. What I find so appealing about the statement offered by Rappaport is how ritual can be a way to create, express, and understand, and that for some people, it may be the only way. I was raised in a household of 3 women from 3 different generations, and we all had our own rituals, and we also had collective rituals. And these formed connections to the more than human and non-humans in our space. We had a ritual for our stovetop once a year, one for our cars, for nature, lost loved ones, and everything became entangled and a sense of equity between humans, us, non-humans, the fridges, stoves, cars, and more than humans, the gods and goddesses, was formed. It was a language we spoke, a way of dialoguing, a practice of building connections to the other. And it was a way of being and becoming in a world that is fluid and ever-changing and constantly asking us to shift and evolve or morph to this as well. So rituals were a pillar for our cultural heritage. This quote and these histories set the scene for what I will offer today. Ritual as a choreographic method for artistic practice. Now, I don't particularly like the term method. For me, it sets the tone of a formula, a set in stone way of becoming bound for success, because they aren't always successful, whatever that means. So rather what I propose today is a way of thinking about identity in relation to artistic practice through our senses. And we'll hold there for a moment, through our senses. So many of us will have a particular dish that reminds us of home, or a smell that connects us to our identity, or a texture, or a particular sound. And the practices I grew up with and the ones that I engage with in my research engage with the senses to charge a space to be activated so that I can feel safe in my identity and to create from a place that leans on my cultural heritage. My artistic practices within undergraduate study had previously focused on two major senses, sound and sight. I would create dances to songs that I like, and I would do moves that I thought looked cool. When the pandemic happened and I was in postgraduate research, I was invited to create in my home, and I found a new connection of creating with my senses. So rather than ritual being a method for my artistic practice, it became a sort of something, that it does do something and sometimes it does not. That there is a sense of becoming with the ritual, evolving with the ritual, which is framed upon my cultural heritage. So I will repropose with the leading inquiry of how my ritual as a practice, as a way of understanding, as a way of seeing, inform choreographic research. Now, I come from a community dance background, and I first learned how to dance in my lounge at home with my mum teaching me moves. And our classes were always in homes where we would push the couches aside and dance. The speaker would glitch because we would jump too high, or we would be dancing outside and we almost never saw what we looked like. So you could imagine the shock when I walked into the studio that looked like the Step Up movies and saw myself dancing in the mirror for the first time. I thought, oh my gosh, do I dance like that? Why does my leg only come up to here and everyone else's is up there? The studio and all these memories had its own rules and expectations. And those rules and expectations refracted onto my practice. So the studio walls, the clean white walls, the sterility, the ballet bars, the expensive lights, the mirrors, these aren't bad things, but over time, they started to reflect to me a version of myself I suddenly didn't really recognize, and I was being shaped by the environment. Placing my practice inside the studio, and then subsequently the wider institution, led me to feel that I should dance a certain way, play certain songs, create certain movements. The sterility and neutrality of the studio felt suffocating in some ways. And it was suffocating because it felt like I couldn't see difference and I couldn't feel that difference. I couldn't smell anything. I couldn't see any images placed haphazardly. And it reminds me of in my home when I feel very embedded in my identity, where it's all a little bit chaos and there's a slight sensorial overload. There's beads hanging from the front door, images of deities everywhere, incense burning, knickknacks, sculptures. It's like every gift I'd ever given my grandmother or my mum found a place in our home and never left. So how could I put a practice that is shaped by Vedic, Indian philosophical ways of becoming in such a space? And why now, after all my years in undergraduate study, do I feel pulled to decolonize my choreographic research? The studio was a place of power. Tracy Banivoama suggests that decolonization process is an identity building practice that relies on uncolonizing the mind, speech, knowledge, and space. So let me ask you some questions. How many times has the space made you feel like you don't belong? If we remove, like taking away the people out of it, just the space itself. Has the space shifted your body posture or the way you perceive yourself? And what would your ideal learning, moving, or creating space feel like? And I ask us to ponder those questions, to breathe with them for a moment, to read them again. When I think about the ways I've worked towards the beginning journey in decolonizing my artistic practice, I often think about space. And I think about the locations that my work has been placed in and the locations that I choose to place my work in. How these spaces, such as a studio, have nurtured meaningful relationships for me. They have taught me a lot about dance, but they've also been a place that started to shape my artistic expression and way of becoming in a world. What happens in that space, the languages that are used, the way difference is or is not present, can linger for years and stick to the walls like glue. So with a bucket of water and dishwashing liquid, I begin washing the walls of this glue to see what resides beneath through ritual. Ritual is a practice that encompasses different layers as explored by Kathleen Manning. These include entering and exiting, revitalization, separation, liminality, and incorporation. And through rituals, there is an active experience of crossing a threshold, to move beyond, to open a door, to see another way, to perceive differently, maybe to clear the walls of glue. So going back to 2020, when I first explored what it meant for my practice to be decolonized, I engaged with rituals in my home again, to continue my artistic practice during a time where the world was slowing down, where we were inside our homes. It was during this time of uncertainty. I regained my familiarity with certain smells, textures, and objects. I spent time with marigold flowers, looking at them, finding a connection with my identity and their two-tone colors. I listened to mantras on repeat and spoke with my grandmother often about rituals and symbolism and what does it mean for us. I was at home and it was a place that felt safe for me to move and create. I was also in postgraduate research, and so I had a 10-minute work that was due in 3 weeks. Our lockdown was lifted, and in that 3 weeks, I had to make a decision on where my work would be situated. I decided that the work needed to be outside, as there were no rules to mold my practice. No mirrors, no black curtains, no glue on the walls. I could light as much incense as I wanted because there were no smoke alarms. I could feel the sun on my skin. I could carve out a performance zone, and I could feel the soil beneath my feet. This artistic practice, titled Shakti Puja, led me to consider the ways I could choreograph or create a ritualistic framework that would hold the performance and the audience. How I could chat to them informally before guiding them to the space with me. That we were breaking apart this performer-audience separation. We were laughing together, we were walking there together. And it was an invitation to be seen in my difference while also recognizing our sameness through the interaction. And our journey together was through that sameness. So through objects and spatial design, I was able to, in some ways, refract my home environment into nature to experience how I understand the world and how I make meaning from this world and what I want to say about the world. I was invited to look at audience in the eyes, to spend time with them, to listen, to speak, to understand that all of these elements are important to my identity. So we come back to that idea of crossing a threshold in rituals. And sorry, I got distracted by my second screen. So we come back to the idea of crossing a threshold. I propose that ritual can decolonize artistic practices through becoming aware of that threshold, that is understanding what is molding our practices and identity by crossing that threshold, that is exploring a sensorially active practice framed on cultural heritage, to undo those bonds and discover new pathways. and many, 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 many other ways. So since my first journey with ritual and research, I've spent a lot of time with them, both the mystic and the secular, to weave and create rituals for my PhD research. I'm at a place now where I'm pulled to place these rituals into the studio. And this requires a sense of world building, that is to create or choreograph the space to be a place where rituals can occur, and subsequently a place where my identity and artistic practice could thrive. These rituals of world building bring objects, materials, sounds, scents, textures, and tastes into the studio to shift my sense of belonging to a place that feels safe for me to create, to think, to explore, to understand, to question, to discuss. And again, sometimes I fail, whatever that means, and sometimes I succeed, whatever that means. So this practice of rituals as world building steers me to recognize that of course we don't all create the same way. And some of us might not feel safe to create in the studio, but we might want to create in the studio. So we might need to shift the environment to refract other geographical locations into this particular space. There is space for new ways of creating, and to recognize that the practice of creating can be shaped by our Indigenous methods and ways of understanding the world. My intention with these rituals now is not to completely strip the walls of glue, so that is my own histories within the studio, nor to completely change the studio. I really am interested now in how this can be a space that is a meeting place or dialogue between my cultural identity and the studio, subsequently the wider institution. A meeting place and a place for both. When I think of what rituals encompass, I consider the ways in which we view our connections to nature, object, materials, as a space of togetherness. I grew up with the saying in Hinduism, that is, I am everyone and everyone is in me, and that when the guests arrive in your home, they are treated as God. And I extend this out to the non-human, to the moments where I watched my grandmother perform a ritual for our stovetop. It was no longer just about us as humans, but about the space and the objects that reside within that space. That these objects come with their own histories, their own meanings and symbolism. They have energy with them. And so what drives my curiosity is what happens when these objects are placed in a space they don't inherently belong to. Much like I felt the first time I stepped into the Step Up studio. What happens when I look around and see my grandmother's and mother's saris draped from the scaffolds, leaving remnants of their perfume as I move around the space? What happens when I place meaningful objects in the studio at the institution? What happens when I taste flavors that remind me of home? Smells that shift the geography of the space where I feel like I'm in the streets of India. And what happens when the other comes into the world? As I consider how deeply rituals have informed my personal practice, I consider how it might feel for someone else to walk into that space. Does it make them feel like they don't belong? Does it shift their body posture or the way they perceive themselves? How does it feel for them to be in my ideal moving and creating environment? I don't have the answers to these questions, but I do think about them often. I think about the ways the space I craft could alienate someone. And this question has allowed me to consider how this ritual as choreographic practice is much more complex than I had initially envisioned. That there isn't a straightforward answer. That the space that I craft could oppress someone while simultaneously liberating someone else, as spaces do. Through this practice of adorning the space, playing mantras, engaging in a sensorially charged practice, I'd crossed over a threshold each time. That for me to take up space to feel grounded in my cultural heritage and identity at the institution, I had to literally take up space, to adorn it, to spend 3 days, to book out the studio for 3 days where no one else could use it, spend time there, to feel what happens when the space is crafted, what changes in my body, what do I want to say now. Through the labor of this ritual and the endurance, I was able to communicate to myself that I belong in this space, and so does my identities, and to really truly believe it. So when I was standing there with my grandmother's saris behind me and my mother's saris behind me, I was starting to understand a little bit more of how I hope to create in this world and how I hope to show up as a researcher, as an artist, as a woman. So once again, I walk alongside Roy Rapaport that some things for some people can only ever really be achieved in ritual. Thank you.
I think we can go ahead and open the floor to some questions. We've still got about 10 minutes left. So yeah.
Hi, I'm Eva. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. It's 4 a.m. here, so you know I mean it when I say it. I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little more about the relationship with the audience and perhaps how the audience may have been activated differently by your use of objects. I've really loved your how you described objects as these godlike guests. I'm really provoked by that. So I'm wondering how your audience responded to that.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. For joining us at 4 in the morning. It's amazing. The relationship with the audience was really formed by this desire to kind of break away the magical performer arriving on stage moment. And I was quite lucky because my performance was based outside. I could really craft what was going on, how I wanted to think about the entrance and the exit for the audience. And I was quite unsettled by placing myself in that, in a position of, I'm going to say power for my practice because I've choreographed the space, to place myself in that already being there and the audience would arrive. I was really thinking about what would it feel like to walk to this space, seeing all these saris and me standing there. So I wanted to break that barrier between us and to treat them like how I was raised growing up, like they are gods, and in some ways they are, like, I like to think of them as performers in the work as well. And so having that care and that relationship building allowed me to feel that energy exchange between us throughout the performance, and to perhaps there were moments where I was gazing at the audience, and so there was that relationship that was already formed prior that could have made that experience more about us being together and less about me showing you something. Yeah. Thank you.
So I have another question. Hi, Alesha. I really loved your talk. Here is 5 a.m. also, so Latin America is here. Um, I was at the beginning of your talk. You asked us, have you ever felt like you don't belong? And then when you were talking about, sorry, this relationship with your space, with your grandmother. How did you manage to join those things that made your identity, and this decolonization new choreography that you were thinking about?
So how the journey began and
How did you manage to use the things that belong to your identity and then decolonize them in order to have a new type of choreography?
It's a really interesting question, and one I always think about as well. And sometimes I think, am I really decolonizing my practice, or what does this mean for my practice? And I think when I went into postgraduate research and I was thinking about what I was curious about in the world, I felt that over the years of working or dancing in the studio with a particular dance practice, that I'd shifted and my identity was kind of fragmented. So I felt in these two worlds of being an Indian woman raised by two Indian in a house of only women, and then the institution, and I felt a sense of belonging at both, but they were separate and were fragmented. And I'd always thought about choreography through a different lens of, I would take this question or this curiosity and I'd make some dance moves in front of the mirror with some sound, and that's my work. When I was invited, or I didn't have a choice because we were in lockdown, to create in my home, I started to find more connections with objects as like collaborators. And then going further through those discussions with my grandmother of symbolism and ritual, and how this became an alternative way for me to lean towards methods of creating or ways of understanding the world that derived from my Indian heritage, and those lenses to bring into my practice. Yeah, I think that maybe may or may not answer your question.
No, it's okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello.
Go for it, Anisha.
Hey, hi Alesha. Thank you so much for the talk. It was super interesting, and we've spoken once before, so it's really nice to hear what you've come up with. I have a question about how you think about Vedic Indian philosophy in your work, because I'd love to hear more about that. And also because from the Indian context, there's a lot of conversation happening about how Vedic Indian philosophy in itself can be a form of internal colonization because it is linked to caste hierarchy and hegemony. And I was wondering if you have like any thoughts on that.
Yes, thank you. And so lovely to see you again. Yeah, that journey has been big. Where do I begin? I've been engaging with the Purushatras in my research. So there's Dharma, Artha, and Kama. And all of those books were written in Sanskrit and I can't understand it. And so I've had to rely on the translations, which have been translated by predominantly men. And those books are very difficult to read and challenging, and especially Kama, because the book is the Kama Sutra. But through that relationship, it's understanding what the philosophy's like foundation is and what maybe these translations have become from that. And I'm really delving into it through my feminist lens, my upbringing, my understandings, and reframing how that can be understood in my creative practice. So Dharma, I'm really looking at the equality and equity between all of us in the work. So myself, the objects, the humans. Ota's about the power and wealth of the work. So where the powers shift, or who has more power in certain moments. And then Kama in the beginning was very much, and this is based on like stereotypes about the sexual energy, but it actually became that sensorially active space of engaging with the senses. And these understandings, just my understandings of how they exist or are existing in my practice would have come over time. But 100% those difficult moments of, especially like being a woman, there's so many very challenging histories that I grew up with that I see perpetuated in the books. And so it's that, like with the moments of the dialogue or the meeting place between the two, it's like meeting these books halfway and then going that way for a little bit and coming back. Yeah, it is a very interesting discussion and challenge as well.
Thank you so much. That makes a lot of sense.
Thank you, Alesha, for your wonderful presentation. It was very interesting. And thank you, everyone, for your engaging questions and discussion.